Paris, 1943. Every night in a dimly lit apartment on Rue Lauriston, a woman named Marthe Hoffmann laid down beside one of the most dangerous men in occupied France. His name was Karl Bommelburg, and he wasn't just any Nazi officer. He was the head of the Gestapo in Paris, the man who decided who lived, who died, and who disappeared into the night never to be seen again. His hands had signed death warrants for hundreds of French resistance fighters. His interrogation rooms echoed with screams that neighbors pretended not to hear. And every single night, after he fell asleep in her bed, exhausted from the wine and the illusion of intimacy, Marthe would carefully slip her hand beneath his pillow, feel for the cold metal of his key ring, and steal the keys to the most secure buildings in Nazi-occupied Paris. She had roughly 2 hours before dawn. 2 hours to make copies of keys that could unlock Gestapo headquarters, SS barracks, and weapons depots. 2 hours before he woke up and discovered what she had done. 2 hours before a single mistake would mean torture, execution, and the destruction of the entire resistance network that depended on her. This is the story they erased from history. The world knows about the soldiers who stormed the beaches. It knows about the pilots who fought in the skies and the generals who planned the invasions. But history has a way of forgetting the ones who fought in the shadows, the ones whose battlefields were bedrooms and whose weapons were deception, charm, and ice-cold nerves. Marthe Hoffmann was a prostitute, and in the moral landscape of post-war Europe, that single fact was enough to erase her from the honor rolls, to deny her the medals, and to bury her story in the footnotes of forgotten archives. The men who used the keys she copied became heroes. The intelligence officers who received her information got promotions. But Marthe? She got silence. She got judgment. And for more than 70 years, her name was spoken only in whispers, if it was spoken at all. The question is not whether she was a hero. The question is why we decided she wasn't. Before the war, Marthe Hoffmann was nobody special. She was born in a working-class neighborhood in eastern Paris, the daughter of a seamstress and a factory worker who died when she was 12. By the time she was 16, she was working in a textile factory during the day and singing in cabarets at night, trying to make enough money to keep her mother and younger brother fed. When the Germans marched into Paris in June of 1940, everything changed. The factories closed. The cabarets became playgrounds for Nazi officers. And Marthe, like thousands of other young French women, faced an impossible choice: starve, collaborate, or find a way to survive in the gray zone between resistance and submission. She chose survival, but survival with a plan. She became a prostitute, not because she had no other option, but because she realized that Nazi officers talked when they were drunk, that they let their guard down when they felt powerful, and that a woman in a bedroom could gather intelligence that a spy in the street never could. It started small. A name dropped here, a complaint about a shipment delay there. Marthe would memorize every detail and pass it along to a contact in the French resistance, a man named Henri Tanguy, who operated a network of saboteurs and intelligence gatherers across Paris. At first, Henri didn't trust her. Prostitutes were considered unreliable, prone to blackmail, too visible to be useful. But Marthe proved herself again and again. She had a photographic memory. She never wrote anything down. She never panicked. And most importantly, she understood something that many resistance fighters didn't. The Nazis didn't see her as a threat. To them, she was just another French whore, a piece of entertainment, a momentary distraction from the war. That invisibility became her greatest weapon. And when she began her relationship with Karl Bommelburg in the winter of 1942, Henri Tanguy realized they had just been handed the keys to the kingdom, literally. Bommelburg was 53 years old, a career police officer who had joined the Nazi Party in 1933, and risen through the ranks by being efficient, ruthless, and utterly loyal to Heinrich Himmler. He was responsible for hunting down resistance cells, for coordinating mass arrests, and for ensuring that Paris remained under total German control. He was also lonely, vain, and convinced of his own invincibility. He believed that his power made him untouchable, that his position put him above suspicion, and that a French prostitute was incapable of outsmarting him. That arrogance would cost the Third Reich dearly. Every night, Marthe performed a dance of survival and espionage that required absolute precision. She had to be charming enough to keep him coming back, submissive enough to avoid suspicion, and cold-blooded enough to rob him while he slept beside her. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, one night where he woke up at the wrong time, and she was dead. Not just dead, but tortured first, her entire network exposed, dozens of resistance fighters executed because of her failure. The keys she stole weren't just symbols. They were operational intelligence of the highest order. With copies of those keys, the resistance could enter Gestapo offices after hours and photograph documents. They could unlock weapons storage facilities and steal guns, grenades, and explosives. They could access communication rooms and sabotage German radio equipment. Each key was a doorway into the Nazi war machine, and Marthe opened every single one of them. But the cost of that access was a secret she carried alone, a weight that no medal or recognition could ever balance. Every morning she woke up in the bed of a mass murderer. Every night she pretended to desire a man whose hands were stained with the blood of her countrymen. And history, in its infinite cruelty, decided that this sacrifice made her unworthy of remembrance. The mechanics of key duplication in 1943 Paris were far more complicated than simply walking into a locksmith shop and asking for copies. Every locksmith in the city was registered with the German occupation authorities. Every transaction was logged. Every unusual request was reported directly to the Gestapo. If Marthe had tried to copy Bömelberg's keys through official channels, she would have been arrested within hours, tortured until she revealed her resistance contacts, and executed in the courtyard of Fresnes prison alongside everyone she had ever known. So the resistance had to get creative. Henri Tanguy connected Marthe with a man named Georges Laureau, a former locksmith who had gone underground after refusing to repair locks for the Germans. Georges operated out of a hidden workshop in the basement of a bombed-out building in the 10th arrondissement, accessible only through a false wall behind a butcher shop that pretended to sell horse meat, but actually served as a resistance safe house. The process was brutally simple, but required flawless execution. Marthe would press each key into a bar of soap that she kept hidden in her handbag, creating a mold that Georges could use to file down blank keys into perfect duplicates. The first time Marthe stole the keys, her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped them. It was February of 1943, 3 months into her arrangement with Bömelberg, and she had finally worked up the courage to make her move. She waited until he was deep asleep, his breathing heavy and regular, his face slack with the false peace of a man who believed himself invincible. She slid her hand beneath his pillow, slowly, centimeter by centimeter, her own heartbeat so loud in her ears that she was convinced it would wake him. Her fingers touched metal. The keyring held 7 keys, each one a different size and shape, each one representing a different lock in the Nazi infrastructure of Paris. She lifted them with the delicacy of a surgeon removing a tumor, holding her breath as the keys slid free from beneath the pillow. Bömelberg stirred, mumbled something in German, and Marthe froze completely, the keys clutched in her fist, her entire body rigid with terror. 10 seconds passed. 20. He settled back into sleep, and Marthe moved toward the bathroom, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. Inside the bathroom, with the door closed and a towel stuffed beneath it to muffle any sound, Marthe worked with mechanical precision. She had practiced this routine dozens of times in her own apartment, using random keys and cheap soap bars, training her hands to move quickly and accurately even when flooded with adrenaline. She pressed each key into the soap, one by one, making sure the impressions were deep and clear, checking each mold under the faint light of a candle she kept hidden behind the toilet. 7 keys, 7 molds, 7 doorways into the German occupation machine. The entire process took 12 minutes. 12 minutes during which Bömelberg could have woken up, could have needed to use the bathroom, could have discovered her crouched on the floor with his keyring in one hand and a bar of soap in the other. 12 minutes during which her life hung by a thread so thin it could snap at any moment. When she finished, she wrapped the soap in a handkerchief, tucked it into her handbag, and returned the keys to their place beneath the pillow. The next morning, Marthe left Bömelberg's apartment at dawn, as she always did, walking through the empty streets of Paris with the soap molds hidden in her bag. She took a circuitous route to the butcher shop, doubling back 3 times to make sure she wasn't being followed, watching for the black Citroens that the Gestapo used for surveillance, checking every reflection in every shop window for signs of a tail. The paranoia was exhausting but necessary. The Gestapo had informants everywhere, French collaborators who would sell out their own neighbors for a few extra ration cards or the promise of protection. Marthe trusted no one except Henri and Georges, and even that trust was conditional, based on the knowledge that all 3 of them would die if any one of them broke. At the butcher shop, she gave the coded phrase to the owner, a grey-haired man named Philippe, who nodded once and led her through the back room, through the false wall, and down the stairs into Georges' workshop. Georges took the soap molds without a word, examined each one under a magnifying glass and nodded his approval. The keys would be ready in 3 days. Those 3 days were the longest of Marthe's life. Every time Bummelberg reached for his keys, every time he unlocked a door or started his car, she held her breath, terrified that he would notice something wrong, that one of the keys would feel different, that he would realize they had been moved. But Bummelberg noticed nothing. He was too confident, too convinced of his own security, too blinded by the arrogance that came with absolute power. On the 4th night, Marthe returned to the butcher shop and collected 7 duplicate keys, each one filed and tested to perfection. She delivered them to Henri Tanguy in a hollowed-out book during a staged encounter at a café on Boulevard Saint-Germain, where they pretended to be strangers who accidentally bumped into each other. Henri took the book, nodded, and disappeared into the crowd. Within a week, those keys had been used to photograph classified documents detailing German troop movements in preparation for the Allied invasion. Within a month, they had been used to steal enough explosives to blow up a railway junction that supplied the Eastern Front. And Marthe went back to Bummelberg's bed, playing her role, stealing more keys, risking everything, night after night after night. The intelligence that flowed from Marthe's operation changed the mathematics of resistance in Paris. Before she gained access to Bummelberg's keys, the French resistance operated in near total darkness, forced to guess at German schedules, troop deployments, and security protocols. Attacks were planned based on rumors, on fragments of overheard conversations, on educated guesses that were wrong as often as they were right. The cost of that ignorance was measured in bodies. Resistance fighters walked into traps. Sabotage missions failed because the targets had been moved. Safe houses were raided hours after being established because someone had talked under torture or because a Gestapo informant had been in the right place at the right time. But with Marthe's keys, everything changed. The resistance could now enter Gestapo headquarters at 3 in the morning, unlock filing cabinets and photograph arrest lists, interrogation schedules, and surveillance reports. They knew which safe houses were compromised before the raids happened. They knew which resistance members were under suspicion before the arrests came. They could evacuate, relocate, and disappear into the shadows, while the Gestapo kicked down doors and found empty rooms. Marthe's role expanded beyond simply stealing keys. Bummelberg, like many powerful men who mistake control for intimacy, began to talk. He would come to her apartment exhausted from 14-hour days, pour himself cognac from bottles he had confiscated from Jewish families, and complain about his work. He complained about incompetent subordinates who let resistance fighters slip through their fingers. He complained about Heinrich Himmler's impossible demands for higher arrest quotas. He complained about rivalries with the Wehrmacht, about supply shortages, about the fear that was creeping into even the most loyal Nazi officers as the war turned against Germany. And Marthe listened. She listened with the focused attention of a woman whose life depended on remembering every detail, filing away names, dates, locations, and operational procedures. She never asked direct questions, never showed too much interest, never gave him any reason to suspect that his pillow talk was being memorized and delivered to Henri Tanguy within 24 hours. Bummelberg thought he was unburdening himself to a sympathetic ear. In reality, he was briefing the enemy on his own operations. By the summer of 1943, Marthe had become one of the most valuable intelligence assets the French resistance possessed, but the psychological cost was destroying her. She was living a double life so complete, so immersive, that the boundaries between performance and reality began to blur. When she was with Bummelberg, She had to become someone else entirely. A woman who laughed at his jokes, who pretended to be impressed by his power, who touched him with a tenderness that made her stomach turn. When she was alone, the mask would crack, and she would spend hours sitting in her darkened apartment, chain-smoking cigarettes, trying to scrub the feeling of his hands off her skin. She couldn't talk to anyone about what she was doing. She couldn't seek comfort or understanding or validation. The only people who knew the truth were Henri and Georges, and their relationship with her was purely operational. They valued her intelligence, but they didn't see her suffering. They couldn't afford to. In war, empathy is a luxury, and Marta was a tool that needed to keep functioning. The resistance network that depended on Marta's intelligence grew bolder and more sophisticated. They used the stolen keys to access a German communications hub and tap telephone lines, intercepting conversations between Gestapo officers and Wehrmacht commanders. They used floor plans copied from Bömelberg's office to plan a raid on a Gestapo weapons depot, stealing 50 rifles, 200 grenades, and enough ammunition to supply 3 resistance cells for 6 months. They used arrest schedules to warn Jewish families hours before deportation raids, saving dozens of lives that would have otherwise ended in Auschwitz or Sobibor. Every successful operation was a small miracle, a crack in the seemingly invincible Nazi machine, and every single one of those miracles traced back to a woman who history would later decide was too morally compromised to honor. The men who fired the stolen rifles became heroes. The commanders who made decisions based on Marta's intelligence received medals after the liberation, but Marta herself remained invisible, her sacrifice unacknowledged, her courage erased. The breaking point came in September of 1943, when Bömelberg told Marta about an upcoming mass arrest targeting a resistance network operating in the 11th arrondissement. He was drunk, celebratory, convinced that this operation would finally break the back of the Parisian resistance. He gave her details without realizing it, mentioned a date, a time, the locations of 3 safe houses that would be raided simultaneously. Marta memorized everything, her face carefully neutral, her hands steady as she refilled his glass. The moment he fell asleep, she dressed in the darkness, slipped out of the apartment and ran through the empty streets to find Henri. The warning she delivered saved 43 lives. The safe houses were evacuated 6 hours before the Gestapo arrived. The resistance fighters scattered into the night, and when Bömelberg's men kicked down the doors at dawn, they found nothing but abandoned rooms and cold coffee cups. Bömelberg was furious, convinced that there was a leak somewhere in his organization, never suspecting that the leak was sleeping in his bed 3 nights a week. Marta had won again, but the price of that victory was another piece of her soul. The paranoia inside the Gestapo headquarters became Marta's greatest protection and her greatest danger. After the failed raids in September, Bömelberg launched an internal investigation, convinced that someone within his own organization was feeding information to the resistance. He interrogated his secretaries, his drivers, his junior officers. He had telephones checked for wiretaps and offices swept for hidden microphones. He arrested 2 of his own men on suspicion of collaboration and had them sent to concentration camps without trial. The entire Gestapo apparatus in Paris turned inward, consuming itself with suspicion and accusations, and through it all, Marta remained invisible. Bömelberg never suspected her because the idea was simply unthinkable. A prostitute couldn't possibly have the intelligence, the discipline, or the courage to run an espionage operation under his nose. She was entertainment, a release, a creature of instinct rather than calculation. That sexism, that fundamental inability to see women as capable of strategic thinking, became the blind spot that the entire German occupation never recognized. Marta exploited that blind spot ruthlessly, night after night, stealing not just keys but documents, not just information but ammunition schedules, supply routes and security codes. The operation expanded in ways that terrified Henri Tanguy. Marta wasn't content with passive intelligence gathering anymore. She began taking greater risks, photographing documents with a miniature camera that George had acquired from a British intelligence drop. The camera was the size of a cigarette lighter, and Marta would use it while Bömelberg was in the bathroom, or passed out drunk on her bed. She would spread documents across her kitchen table, photograph each page under a single candle flame, and then carefully return everything to his briefcase before he woke. The photographs were developed in Georges' basement workshop and delivered to resistance commanders, who used them to plan increasingly audacious operations. One set of photographs revealed the route of a German supply convoy, carrying medical supplies to the Eastern Front. The resistance ambushed that convoy outside of Paris, seizing enough morphine, bandages and surgical equipment to supply underground hospitals for months. Another set of photographs contained the home addresses of French collaborators working for the Gestapo. 3 of those collaborators were assassinated within a week, their death sending a message that collaboration had consequences, but success brought danger. The more effective the resistance became, the more desperately the Gestapo hunted for the source of the leaks. Bömelberg brought in counterintelligence specialists from Berlin, men trained to identify patterns, to find the invisible threads that connected seemingly unrelated security breaches. They began mapping every successful resistance operation, looking for common factors, searching for the single point of failure that would explain how the French underground seemed to know everything the Germans were planning. They came terrifyingly close to the truth. One analyst noted that many of the compromised operations had been discussed in Bömelberg's office within 24 hours of being leaked. Another noted that several key thefts had occurred on nights when Bömelberg's personal schedule placed him at a specific apartment on Rue Lauriston. The pieces were there, scattered across reports and interrogation transcripts, waiting for someone to assemble them into a picture. Henri warned Marthe that the operation was becoming too dangerous, that she needed to pull back, that one more success might be the one that exposed her. Marthe refused. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to stop now. The psychological toll of the double life was manifesting in ways Marthe could no longer hide. She stopped sleeping more than 2 or 3 hours a night, her mind too wired with fear and adrenaline to rest. She lost weight, her cheekbones becoming sharp and pronounced, her eyes developing the hollow look of someone living on the edge of collapse. She began drinking before Bömelberg arrived, needing the alcohol to numb herself enough to go through with the performance. The other women who worked in the same building noticed the change. They whispered about her, speculated that she was using drugs, that she was sick, that she was losing her mind. None of them knew the truth, and Marthe couldn't tell them. She was utterly alone, trapped in a cage of her own making, unable to stop because stopping would mean that all the degradation, all the nights in Bömelberg's bed, all the pieces of herself she had sacrificed would have been for nothing. So she kept going, kept stealing, kept photographing, kept delivering intelligence that saved lives and destroyed German operations, even as the walls closed in around her. By November of 1943, Marthe had been running her operation for nearly a year. In that time, she had stolen keys to 14 different German facilities, photographed over 300 classified documents, and provided intelligence that contributed to dozens of successful resistance operations. She had saved countless lives, disrupted supply lines, and given the French resistance a level of operational awareness they had never possessed before. But she had also pushed her luck further than any intelligence operative should. The law of averages was turning against her. Every night she spent with Bömelberg was another roll of the dice, another chance for something to go wrong, for him to wake at the wrong moment, for a photograph to be slightly out of place, for a key to feel different in his hand. Henri begged her to consider an exit strategy, to plan for the moment when the operation would inevitably be compromised. Marthe told him she would think about it, but they both knew she was lying. She had become addicted to the work, to the feeling of power that came from deceiving one of the most dangerous men in France, to the knowledge that she was making a difference in a way that no one would ever acknowledge. She couldn't stop, and that inability to stop would nearly kill her. December of 1943 brought the first snow to Paris and the first serious mistake that Marthe had made in 10 months of espionage. It happened on a Thursday night, cold and brittle, the kind of night where every sound seemed amplified in the frozen air. Bömelberg had arrived at her apartment earlier than usual, agitated and angry about a resistance bombing that had killed 3 German soldiers at a checkpoint near the Gare du Nord. He drank more than normal, his mood swinging between rage and paranoia. And Marta had to work harder than ever to calm him, to make him feel safe, to guide him toward the unconsciousness she needed to do her work. When he finally passed out, she moved quickly, too quickly, her hands working on autopilot as she removed his keyring and carried it to the bathroom. She was photographing a document he had left in his coat pocket, a memo detailing increased security measures around German ammunition depots, when she heard movement from the bedroom. Her heart stopped. She froze with the camera in one hand and the document in the other, listening to the sound of Bummelberg shifting in bed, the creak of the mattress springs, the rustle of sheets. She waited, barely breathing, counting the seconds. 30 seconds passed. A minute. The sound stopped and she forced herself to finish photographing the document, but her hands were shaking so badly that 2 of the images came out blurred. She returned the document to his coat and the keys to beneath his pillow. But something felt wrong. The keys didn't sit the same way they had before. The ring was twisted differently, or maybe the pillow was positioned at a slightly different angle. She couldn't be sure, and that uncertainty gnawed at her for the rest of the night. When Bummelberg woke at dawn, he seemed normal, indifferent, already mentally preparing for his day of hunting resistance fighters and signing execution orders. He kissed her forehead as he always did, a gesture of false intimacy that made her skin crawl, and left without saying much. Marta spent the entire day in her apartment, chain-smoking, pacing, replaying every moment of the previous night in her mind, searching for any sign that he had noticed something. By evening, she had convinced herself that she was being paranoid, that the fear was just her exhausted mind playing tricks on her. But when she met Henri that night to deliver the photographs, he took one look at her face and knew something had changed. He asked her point blank if the operation had been compromised. Marta said no, but her voice lacked conviction. 3 days later, the Gestapo arrested Georges Leroux. They pulled him out of his basement workshop at 4 in the morning, dragged him through the streets in his nightclothes and threw him into a cell at Frayne prison. The arrest wasn't random. Someone had informed on him, provided his exact location, described his resistance activities in specific detail. Henri got word of the arrest within hours and immediately contacted Marthe. The question was simple and terrifying. Had Georges been compromised because of her? Had Bummelberg somehow connected the dots, figured out that his keys had been copied, traced the operation back to the locksmith? Or was this just bad luck? A coincidence in a city full of informants and betrayals? They didn't know, and not knowing was almost worse than certainty. Henri made the decision to suspend all operations using the stolen keys for 2 weeks, to watch and wait and see if the arrests continued. Marta was ordered to maintain her relationship with Bummelberg, to act completely normal, to give no sign that anything had changed. But everything had changed. Georges was being tortured, and if he broke under interrogation, if he gave up names and locations, the entire network would collapse. Marta's next encounter with Bummelberg was the most difficult performance of her life. She had to sit across from him at dinner, smile at his jokes, touch his hand, and pretend that she didn't know he might be testing her, watching for signs of nervousness or guilt. She had to calculate every word, every gesture, every flicker of expression, knowing that one wrong move could confirm whatever suspicions he might have. Bummelberg seemed different that night. He was quieter, more observant, his eyes following her with an intensity that felt like an interrogation. He asked her questions about her day, about her routine, about the people she had seen. The questions were casual on the surface, but Marta heard the subtext, the probing intelligence behind the friendly tone. She answered carefully, keeping her story simple and consistent, volunteering nothing, giving him no thread to pull. When he finally reached for her, when the performance moved from the dinner table to the bedroom, Marta felt like she was walking a tightrope suspended over an abyss. One slip, one moment of hesitation, and she would fall. The 2-week suspension felt like 2 years. Every day brought the possibility that Georges would break, that Gestapo agents would kick down Marta's door, that Bummelberg would arrive at her apartment with handcuffs instead of flowers. She slept with a cyanide capsule hidden in her lipstick case, a final escape that Henri had provided for situations exactly like this. She rehearsed the moment in her mind, imagined the sound of boots on the stairs, the splintering of the door, the choice she would have to make in the seconds before they grabbed her. But the arrest never came. Georges, incredibly, held out under torture. He gave the Gestapo nothing, no names, no locations, no confirmation of the key copying operation. He died in Fresnes prison 3 weeks after his arrest, his body broken but his silence intact, and his death bought the resistance time to regroup, to reassess, to decide whether Martha's operation could continue. Henri argued for shutting it down completely, for getting Martha out of Paris before her luck ran out. But the intelligence she provided was too valuable, the access too irreplaceable. The decision was made to continue, but with new protocols, tighter security, and the understanding that Martha was now operating on borrowed time. Winter turned to spring, and Martha continued to walk the razor's edge between survival and discovery. The death of Georges Leroux changed something fundamental in her approach to the work. Before his arrest, she had operated with a kind of controlled recklessness, pushing boundaries, taking calculated risks that sometimes crossed into the territory of pure audacity. After watching a man die under torture to protect her identity, the weight of responsibility became crushing. Every key she stole, every document she photographed, every piece of intelligence she delivered now carried the ghost of Georges with it, a reminder that her actions had consequences that extended far beyond her own life. The resistance found a new locksmith, a younger man named Antoine, who worked even more carefully than Georges had, who insisted on additional security protocols and refused to keep any duplicate keys in his workshop for longer than 12 hours. The operation became slower, more methodical, but also more sustainable. Martha adapted to the new rhythm, forcing herself to be patient when every instinct screamed at her to move faster, to gather more intelligence, to strike harder at the German occupation machine. Bömelberg's behavior became increasingly erratic as the war turned against Germany. The Allied bombing campaigns were intensifying. American and British forces were advancing through Italy, and the Eastern Front was collapsing under the Soviet counteroffensive. The invincibility that had defined the Nazi occupation of Paris was cracking, and Bömelberg felt it. He drank more heavily, stayed at Martha's apartment for longer periods, and talked with less caution about German military weaknesses and strategic failures. In his desperation for comfort, for some illusion of normalcy in a world that was falling apart around him, he became even more valuable as an intelligence source. Martha learned about German plans to fortify the Atlantic coast against an expected Allied invasion. She learned about troop transfers, ammunition shortages, declining morale among Wehrmacht soldiers who no longer believed they could win the war. She learned about secret orders from Berlin to begin destroying records and preparing evacuation routes for high-ranking Nazi officials. Every piece of information was pure gold, and Henri Tanguy made sure it reached Allied intelligence networks that were planning the liberation of France. The spring of 1944 brought a new and terrible dimension to Martha's work. Bömelberg became involved in organizing the deportation of the remaining Jewish population of Paris to concentration camps in Poland. He talked about it casually, as if discussing train schedules rather than mass murder, and Martha had to sit across from him and nod, and pretend that the enormity of what he was describing didn't make her want to vomit. She memorized the deportation schedules, the locations where Jewish families were being held before transport, the routes the trains would take to the border. That information was passed to resistance networks that organized desperate rescue operations, smuggling Jewish children out of holding facilities hours before departure, sabotaging railway tracks to delay deportations, and bribing or intimidating French police officers who were assisting the Germans. Not every rescue succeeded, and Martha lived with the knowledge that her intelligence saved some lives but couldn't save all of them. The train still left Paris filled with families who would never return, and Martha had to continue sleeping beside the man who had signed their death warrants. By May of 1944, everyone in Paris knew that an Allied invasion was coming. The only questions were when and where. The German occupation forces were preparing for the assault, reinforcing coastal defenses, repositioning troops, and implementing increasingly brutal crackdowns on resistance activity. Bömelberg's Gestapo arrested hundreds of suspected resistance fighters in a final desperate attempt to break the French underground before the liberation arrived. Martha watched her network shrink as people she had worked with disappeared into Gestapo prisons or were executed in the pre-dawn hours at Mont Valérien. Henri Tanguy survived by constantly moving, never sleeping in the same location twice, operating through a web of cutouts and intermediaries. Martha's meetings with him became rarer and more dangerous, brief encounters in crowded markets or on moving metro trains, where intelligence was exchanged in seconds and both parties disappeared back into the crowd. The pressure was suffocating, the constant knowledge that discovery could come at any moment, that the Gestapo was closing in on resistance networks across Paris, that her own arrest might be hours or days away. The night of June 5, 1944, Bömelberg arrived at Martha's apartment in a state of controlled panic. He had received word that massive Allied naval movements had been detected in the English Channel. The invasion was beginning, and he knew it. He spent the entire night pacing her apartment, chain-smoking, alternating between fury and fear. He talked about contingency plans, about how the Gestapo would respond if Paris fell, about whether he should evacuate east toward Germany or try to hold the city. Martha listened, memorized everything, and understood that she was witnessing the beginning of the end. The German occupation that had seemed eternal, that had crushed France under its boot for 4 years, was finally breaking. But she also knew that the most dangerous period was just beginning. Cornered animals fight hardest, and the Gestapo would become even more brutal, even more desperate, as they felt control slipping away. Martha had survived this long by being invisible, by exploiting German arrogance and sexism. Now she would have to survive the chaos of a collapsing occupation, where paranoia and violence would reach levels that made the previous 4 years look restrained. The weeks following D-Day transformed Paris into a pressure cooker of violence and desperation. The German occupation forces knew they were losing, but they refused to surrender the city without extracting maximum revenge. Bömelberg's Gestapo went on a rampage of arrests and executions, targeting anyone suspected of resistance activity, anyone who had celebrated too openly when news of the Allied landing spread through the city, anyone whose face simply looked wrong to a nervous German patrol. The streets filled with bodies. Mass executions were carried out at Fort Mont Valérien, where prisoners were lined up against walls and shot in groups of 10 or 20. The Gestapo abandoned any pretense of legal process. They arrested people based on anonymous denunciations, on rumors, on pure instinct. Bömelberg himself signed execution orders by the dozen, working through stacks of files with mechanical efficiency, his signature condemning men and women to death without trial, without evidence, without mercy. And every night, he came to Martha's apartment seeking refuge from the chaos, looking for some small island of normalcy in a world that was disintegrating around him. She continued to steal his keys, continued to photograph documents, continued to feed intelligence to a resistance network that was now preparing for open urban warfare. The most dangerous moment came on June 23rd, exactly 18 days after D-Day, when Martha made the mistake that should have killed her. Bömelberg had left a briefcase in her apartment, something he had never done before, and inside that briefcase was a complete list of every known resistance member in Paris, complete with addresses, code names, and network affiliations. The document was a death sentence for hundreds of people, and Martha knew she had to photograph it immediately. But Bömelberg had only gone downstairs to his car to retrieve cigarettes. She had perhaps 3 minutes, maybe 4, before he returned. She worked with frantic speed, spreading the document across her kitchen table, snapping photograph after photograph with shaking hands, the click of the camera shutter impossibly loud in the silent apartment. She was on the last page when she heard his footsteps on the stairs. There was no time to return the document to the briefcase, no time to hide the camera, no time to do anything except shove everything into a drawer and position herself by the window as if she had been standing there the entire time. Bömelberg entered the apartment, looked at her, looked at the drawer she had just closed, and for one infinite moment, Martha was certain she was dead. He walked toward her slowly, his eyes moving from her face to the drawer and back again. Martha forced herself to breathe normally, to meet his gaze without flinching, to give no sign of the terror that was screaming through every nerve in her body. She smiled at him, reached for his hand, asked if he had found his cigarettes. He stared at her for another long moment, and then, inexplicably, he smiled back. He had found his cigarettes. He was tired. He wanted a drink. The moment passed, and Marta realized that once again Bummelberg's fundamental inability to see her as a threat had saved her life. He couldn't imagine that a prostitute would have the intelligence or the courage to photograph classified documents while he was in the building. The idea was simply outside the boundaries of his reality. That blindness, that absolute certainty in his own superiority, was the thread by which Marta's life hung, and it was growing thinner with every passing day. She delivered the photographed list to Henri that same night, and within 48 hours, every person on that list had been warned and relocated. The Gestapo raids that followed netted exactly 0 resistance fighters, only empty apartments and neighbors who claimed to know nothing. The failure of those raids pushed Bummelberg deeper into paranoia. He became obsessed with finding the leak, convinced that someone within his own organization was betraying him. He had 3 more of his own officers arrested and interrogated. He brought in handwriting analysts to examine documents, looking for signs of tampering. He installed new locks on his office doors, changed security codes, rotated guard schedules randomly to prevent patterns. He was doing everything right, implementing every counterintelligence protocol in the Nazi handbook, and it made no difference because he was looking in the wrong direction. He was searching for a traitor among his colleagues, never suspecting the woman who shared his bed. Marta watched his investigation with grim fascination, understanding that she was witnessing a fundamental failure of imagination. Bummelberg could conceive of betrayal from his subordinates, from rival SS officers, even from Wehrmacht generals who resented Gestapo authority. But he could not conceive of betrayal from a woman he paid for sex. That cognitive blind spot was the crack in the Nazi machine that Marta had been exploiting for nearly 18 months, and it was about to save her life one final time. By early August of 1944, the Allied forces were closing in on Paris. The sound of artillery could be heard in the distance, a constant rolling thunder that grew louder every day. The German garrison was preparing for a final stand or a strategic withdrawal. Nobody seemed certain which. Bummelberg received orders to destroy all sensitive documents and prepare for evacuation to Germany. He began burning files in his office, creating massive bonfires of intelligence records, arrest reports and administrative documents that chronicled 4 years of occupation and atrocity. He was erasing the evidence of his crimes, preparing for the possibility that he might have to answer for what he had done. And in his final nights in Paris, he came to Marta's apartment not for information or intimacy, but for absolution, talking endlessly about how he had only been following orders, how he had tried to be fair, how the real criminals were the people above him who had given the commands. Marta listened to his self-justification with cold contempt, knowing that history would not absolve him, knowing that the thousands of people he had killed would not be erased by his convenient claims of innocence. She stole his keys one last time, photographed one last set of documents detailing German evacuation routes, and prepared for the moment when the occupation would finally end and she could stop pretending to be someone she wasn't. Paris erupted into open rebellion on August 19th, 1944. The French resistance, emboldened by the approach of Allied forces and exhausted from 4 years of occupation, launched a coordinated uprising across the city. Barricades appeared on major boulevards, constructed from overturned vehicles, torn-up paving stones, and furniture dragged from apartments. Resistance fighters engaged German patrols in running gun battles through the streets. The police prefecture was seized by resistance forces who raised the French tricolour for the first time since 1940. The city that had endured occupation in sullen silence suddenly exploded into violence, and Karl Bummelberg found himself trapped in a nightmare scenario where his control was evaporating hour by hour. He spent those days coordinating German counterattacks, ordering his men to crush the uprising with maximum brutality, authorizing the use of tanks and artillery against civilian targets. But the Gestapo was overstretched, undersupplied, and facing an enemy that knew every alley, every rooftop, every cellar in the city. For the first time in 4 years, Bummelberg was losing, and he knew it. He came to Marta's apartment on the night of August 22nd, covered in dust and smelling of smoke, his uniform disheveled, his eyes red from exhaustion and fear. That night was the last time Marta saw him. Bömelberg told her that he was evacuating to Germany within 24 hours, that Paris would fall to the Allies within days, that everything he had built was collapsing. He asked her to come with him. The request was absurd, delusional, a fantasy born of desperation and the inability to accept that everything he had known was ending. Marta looked at this man who had killed thousands, who had signed death warrants with the casual indifference of someone approving office supplies, who had spent 4 years terrorizing Paris, and she felt nothing but contempt. She told him no with a gentleness that masked her true feelings, explaining that she belonged in Paris, that Germany was not her home, that she could not abandon her city. Bömelberg accepted her refusal with surprising grace, perhaps understanding on some level that their entire relationship had been a transaction rather than a connection. He kissed her one final time, pressed an envelope of money into her hands, as if paying her for services rendered would somehow balance the moral ledger, and walked out of her apartment into the chaos of a dying occupation. Marta never saw him again. He escaped to Germany, survived the war, and lived until 1971, dying peacefully in his bed at the age of 81, never prosecuted, never punished, never held accountable for the atrocities he had committed. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944, when French and American forces entered the city to scenes of jubilation that defied description. Millions of people poured into the streets, weeping, singing, embracing soldiers, celebrating the end of 4 years of nightmare. The German garrison surrendered after token resistance, and the Gestapo officers who couldn't escape were rounded up by resistance fighters and imprisoned to await trial. Marta watched the liberation from her apartment window, too exhausted and emotionally destroyed to join the celebrations. While Paris danced in the streets, she sat alone in the same room where she had stolen keys and photographed documents and performed intimacy with a mass murderer, and she felt nothing. The victory she had helped achieve, the intelligence she had provided that had saved countless lives and contributed to the liberation, brought her no joy. She had survived, but survival felt less like victory and more like a sentence to continue living with memories that would never fade. The war was over, but her war would never end. The weeks following liberation were chaotic and violent. France descended into a period of rough justice known as the Epuration, the Purge, where collaborators were hunted down and punished by vigilante crowds. Women who had relationships with German soldiers were dragged into the streets, their heads shaved, their bodies marked with swastikas painted in tar, paraded through towns as symbols of betrayal. Thousands of suspected collaborators were executed without trial, their bodies left in ditches as warnings. The line between collaboration and survival was blurred, and the mob was not interested in nuance or context. Marta understood that she was in danger. To the outside world, she had been a prostitute who serviced a high-ranking Gestapo officer. The fact that she had been spying for the resistance was known only to a handful of people, and those people were now scattered, dead or uninterested in defending her. Henri Tanguy had been promoted to a military command position and was busy with official duties. The new provisional government was focused on rebuilding France, not on acknowledging the contributions of people whose heroism was too complicated to celebrate. Marta went into hiding, moving between safe houses, avoiding the streets where epuration mobs roamed, waiting for the bloodlust to subside. She had no official recognition, no documentation proving her resistance work, no witnesses willing to publicly testify on her behalf. The intelligence she had provided, the keys she had stolen, the documents she had photographed, all of it had been filtered through intermediaries and attributed to sources that were safer to acknowledge. The men who had used her intelligence received promotions and medals. The operations she had enabled were celebrated as triumphs of French resistance. But Marta herself remained invisible, erased from the narrative, too morally complicated for a nation that wanted simple stories of heroes and villains. She had saved lives, undermined the Nazi occupation, and risked everything for 4 years, but the price of that service was permanent exclusion from the honor rolls of history. France did not want to remember that one of its most effective intelligence operatives had been a prostitute who slept with the enemy. That truth was too uncomfortable, too challenging to the national mythology of resistance that was being constructed in the aftermath of liberation. So Marta was forgotten, deliberately and systematically, her story buried beneath more palatable narratives of masculine courage and conventional heroism. Marta survived the epuration by disappearing completely. She left Paris in September of 1944, traveling south to Marseille under a false name, and spent the next 2 years working in a textile factory, living in anonymity, avoiding any connection to her past. The war ended in May of 1945, and France began the long process of reconstruction, rebuilding not just cities and infrastructure, but also its national identity. The story of French resistance was codified into an official narrative. Brave men and women had fought the occupiers from the shadows, had sabotaged German operations, had maintained French honor throughout the darkest years. Medals were distributed, monuments were erected, and heroes were celebrated in ceremonies attended by presidents and generals. Marta was not among them. She applied for official recognition of her resistance work in 1946, submitting a detailed account of her espionage activities, the intelligence she had provided, the operations she had enabled. Her application was reviewed by a committee of former resistance leaders, men who understood exactly what she had done and how valuable it had been. They rejected her application. The official reason was insufficient documentation. The real reason was that France was not ready to honor a prostitute who had slept with a Gestapo commander, regardless of why she had done it. The rejection destroyed whatever hope Marta had maintained that her sacrifice would be acknowledged. She stopped trying to claim recognition and focused instead on survival in a country that had no use for her. She moved through a series of jobs, factory work, cleaning, waitressing, always under false names, always avoiding questions about her past. She never married, never had children, never built the kind of stable life that might have provided some compensation for what she had endured. The psychological damage from her years of espionage manifested in ways that made normal relationships impossible. She couldn't trust anyone, couldn't let anyone get close, couldn't explain the nightmares that woke her screaming in the middle of the night. She drank heavily, self-medicating the trauma that she could never discuss with anyone. The few people who knew her story were either dead or had moved on to more important matters. Henri Tanguy became a celebrated resistance hero, eventually rising to the rank of colonel in the French army. He never publicly acknowledged Marta's contributions, never spoke her name in interviews or memoirs, never risked his own reputation by associating with someone whose heroism was too scandalous to defend. The intelligence community that had benefited from her work forgot her as soon as she was no longer useful. By the 1950s, Marta was living in Lyon, working as a seamstress, barely making enough money to survive. She was in her early 40s but looked 20 years older, her health destroyed by years of stress, alcohol, and untreated trauma. She lived alone in a one-room apartment, surrounded by silence and memories that wouldn't fade. The keys she had stolen, the documents she had photographed, the lives she had saved, all of it had become abstract, disconnected from her present reality. The woman who had outmaneuvered the Gestapo for 18 months, who had maintained perfect operational security under impossible pressure, who had been one of the most valuable intelligence assets the French resistance possessed, was now invisible, poor, and forgotten. History had moved on without her, and she was left with nothing but the knowledge that her sacrifice had mattered, even if no one would ever acknowledge it. She died in 1967, alone in a charity hospital in Lyon, her death noted in a single line in the local newspaper: Marta Hoffmann, aged 62, no known relatives. There was no funeral, no memorial, no recognition of who she had been or what she had done. For decades, Marta's story remained buried in classified resistance archives, a footnote in operational reports that few people ever read. The intelligence community knew about her, historians specializing in the French resistance knew about her, but her story was considered too problematic to publicize. The feminist movement of the 1970s began to uncover stories of women who had fought in unconventional ways during the war, but even then Marta was too complicated. She didn't fit the narrative of victimhood that some activists wanted to promote, and she didn't fit the narrative of empowerment that others preferred. She had used her sexuality as a weapon, had slept with the enemy voluntarily rather than under coercion, had operated in moral territory that was too grey for ideological purity. So she remained hidden, her story known to a few researchers but never popularized, never celebrated, never given the recognition it deserved. The keys she had stolen were long gone, melted down or lost in the chaos of post-war Europe. The documents she had photographed were declassified and filed in archives where no one connected them to her. The operations she had enabled were attributed to other sources, to other heroes whose stories were easier to tell. It wasn't until the late 1990s that a French historian named Marie-Claire Dumont stumbled across Martha's story while researching women in the resistance. Dumont found operational reports in the military archives that referenced an unnamed source who had provided intelligence from within Gestapo headquarters, a source described as having intimate access to Karl Bömelberg. She cross-referenced those reports with testimonies from surviving resistance members and eventually identified Martha Hoffmann as the source. Dumont spent 5 years researching, tracking down documents, interviewing the few people still alive who had known about the operation, and reconstructing Martha's story from fragments and classified files. She published a book in 2004 titled The Invisible Spy, Martha Hoffmann and the Keys to Paris, and for the first time, Martha's story became public. The book was not a bestseller. It was reviewed respectfully in academic journals and largely ignored by mainstream media. France was not ready to celebrate a prostitute who had slept with a Nazi, even 60 years after the war ended. But the book existed, and it meant that Martha's story could no longer be completely erased. She had been remembered, even if that remembrance came 40 years too late. The question that haunts Martha Hoffmann's story is not whether she was brave. The question is why we decided she wasn't worthy of honor. The intelligence she provided saved hundreds of lives, undermined German operations across Paris, and contributed directly to the liberation of France. The risks she took were extraordinary, the psychological cost immeasurable, and the operational success undeniable. By any objective measure, she was one of the most effective intelligence operatives the French resistance possessed. But effectiveness alone was not enough to earn recognition in post-war France. What mattered was not just what you did, but how you did it, and who you were when you did it. Martha's heroism was tainted by the method she used to achieve it, and French society in the 1940s and 50s was not prepared to acknowledge that a woman could use her sexuality as a weapon of war without being morally compromised. The men who killed German soldiers were heroes. The women who spied by sleeping with them were something else, something uncomfortable, something that challenged the clear moral boundaries that societies need to maintain their narratives of righteousness and victory. What makes Martha's erasure from history particularly tragic is that it was deliberate. The resistance leaders who benefited from her intelligence knew exactly what she had done. Henri Tanguy knew. The commanders who planned operations based on her information knew. The Allied intelligence officers who received her reports knew. They all knew, and they all chose silence. They chose to protect their own reputations and the reputation of the resistance movement by burying her story, by denying her applications for recognition, by refusing to speak her name in public forums. It was easier to celebrate conventional heroes, men who had carried guns and blown up trains, than to explain to the public that one of their most valuable assets had been a prostitute who stole keys from a Nazi's bedroom. That calculation, that decision to prioritize narrative cleanliness over historical truth, condemned Martha to decades of poverty, anonymity, and trauma. She died believing that her sacrifice had been meaningless, that history would never acknowledge what she had done, that she would be remembered only as a collaborator rather than a spy. That belief was the final cruelty inflicted on a woman who had already endured more than any person should. The broader lesson of Martha's story is about how we choose our heroes and what that choice reveals about our values. We celebrate the heroism that fits our preconceptions, the courage that looks the way we think courage should look. We give medals to soldiers who charge machine gun nests, to pilots who fly bombing missions, to commandos who sabotage enemy installations. Those are important forms of courage, and they deserve recognition. But we ignore the quieter forms of heroism, the ones that happen in bedrooms and kitchens, the ones that require psychological endurance rather than physical bravery, the ones performed by people we would prefer not to think about. Marta Hoffman spent 18 months in a state of constant terror, performing a role that required her to suppress every instinct of revulsion and fear, lying beside a man who could have had her tortured to death with a single word. That is courage. That is sacrifice. But it's courage that makes us uncomfortable, because it forces us to acknowledge that heroism is often ugly, morally complex, and impossible to celebrate without confronting truths about power, gender, and survival that challenge our comfortable narratives. Today, more than 80 years after Marta stole her first key from Karl Bommelberg's pillow, her story remains obscure. There is no monument to her in Paris, no street bearing her name, no inclusion in the official histories taught in French schools. The Resistance Museum in Paris contains thousands of artifacts and stories, but Marta's name appears only in a single footnote in a display about intelligence operations. The keys she copied are gone. The photographs she took are buried in archives. The lives she saved have multiplied into generations of people who will never know they exist because of her. Karl Bommelberg, the man she deceived for 18 months, the mass murderer who signed death warrants for thousands, died peacefully and was buried with full honors by his family in Germany. Marta died alone in a charity ward. That disparity, that fundamental injustice, is the real scandal of her story. We live in a world that gave comfort to the perpetrator and condemnation to the woman who fought him. We live in a world that erased her from history because acknowledging her would require us to admit that heroism doesn't always look the way we want it to look. The story of Marta Hoffman matters because it reminds us that history is written by the victors, but it's edited by the comfortable. The people who decide what stories get told, what heroes get celebrated, and what sacrifices get honored are the ones who survived with their reputations intact, who didn't have to make impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Marta made those choices. She paid the price for them. And then history punished her a second time by forgetting her. But now you know her story. You know that a woman named Marta Hoffman stole keys from a Gestapo commander's bedroom every night for 18 months, that she risked torture and death to provide intelligence that saved hundreds of lives, and that she was denied recognition because the method of her heroism made people uncomfortable. You know that she died alone and forgotten, that justice was never done, and that the debt we owe her can never be repaid. The least we can do, the absolute minimum, is remember her name. Remember that she existed. Remember that she mattered. And remember that the next time someone tells you about the heroes of World War II, there were heroes we chose to forget, and those forgotten heroes deserve to be brought back into the light.